The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets meets in Petrograd on the night of October the 26th, 1917. The Winter Palace has fallen hours earlier. Lenin takes the podium and reads a single decree. Article 1 abolishes landed proprietorship forthwith, without any compensation of any kind. The vote is near unanimous. No debate of consequence. In the time it takes to read 2 pages aloud, the largest imperial fortune in European history passes from private ownership into the custody of a state that is 6 hours old. The Romanovs do not yet know. Nicholas and Alexandra are 1,500 kilometers east, under guard in Tobolsk, sleeping in a former governor's mansion with peeling wallpaper and a leaking roof. Their palaces in Petrograd and Tsarskoye Selo are already empty of family. They will not be empty of treasure for much longer. What follows over the next 9 months is not a single act of confiscation, but a cascade of legal instruments, each one stripping away a different layer of what the dynasty had accumulated across 304 years of continuous rule. The decree on land takes the ground. 150 million hectares of arable, pasture and forest land, including all crown estates, all monastery holdings, all church properties transferred to land committees and Soviets of peasant deputies. The crown lands in the Altai and Transbaikal regions alone total over 65 million hectares, containing gold, silver, copper and coal mines that had generated 6 to 7 million rubles in annual revenue. Gone. 7 weeks later, on December the 14th, the decree on nationalisation of banks declares banking a state monopoly. All private banks are merged into the state bank. Every safe deposit box in every bank in Russia is subject to inspection and seizure. The Romanovs' domestic accounts, Nicholas's personal funds, the appanages of Grand Dukes, the household budgets of imperial residences, cease to exist as accessible assets. On January the 21st, 1918, the decree on annulment of state loans repudiates every financial obligation of every previous Russian government. Bonds, treasury notes, securities, all void. Foreign creditors who had lent billions to the Tsarist state receive nothing. On February the 19th, the fundamental law of land socialization goes further than the original decree. It abolishes all property in land, underground wealth, waters, forests, and living natural forces for all time, not temporarily, not continuously, for all time. And on July the 10th, the Constitution of the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic disenfranchises, by name, members of the former reigning dynasty. They cannot vote. They cannot hold office. They are, in the legal architecture of the new state, non-persons who happen to still be breathing. 9 months, 6 major legal instruments. The cumulative effect is total. There is no longer a legal category called Romanov property. There are no accounts to freeze because the banks are the state. There are no lands to seize because land itself cannot be owned. There are no bonds to default on because all bonds are void. The family that had ruled 1/6 of the Earth's land surface possesses, in law, nothing at all. What they possessed, in fact, the crown jewels, the Hermitage paintings, the Fabergé eggs, the palaces, the personal jewellery, now belongs to the state. The question is no longer who owns it. The question is what the state intends to do with it. The answer arrives in stages. 773 pieces of crown jewellery will be catalogued, appraised, and sorted into 3 categories. 569 of them, 73.6%, will be sold to foreign buyers, many for a fraction of their appraised value. 48 acknowledged masterpieces will leave the Hermitage and never return, including a Raphael that will cost that American buyer just over $1 million and will one day anchor the National Gallery of Art in Washington. At least 14 imperial Fabergé eggs will be exported from Russia between 1930 and 1933, some selling at auction for $400 during the Depression, one surfacing 8 decades later at an American flea market with a price tag of $13,302. And a fortune in personal jewellery will escape in cocoa tins, Gladstone bags, and corsets sewn by the Tsar's own daughters. Corsets that will deflect bullets on the night the family dies. This is the story of what the Romanovs had, what the Bolsheviks took, and what happened to every piece of it. To understand the scale of what those decrees erased, it is necessary to understand what existed before them. The popular estimate of $300 billion for the Romanov family's pre-revolution wealth is widely cited but deeply misleading. It conflates the personal wealth of Nicholas II with the vast state apparatus he merely administered. The critical distinction, first formalised by Peter the Great in 1719 and codified in Paul I's 1797 statute on the imperial family, separated crown property from the personal Romanov fortune. The palaces, the regalia, the Hermitage collection, the crown lands, these belonged to the Russian state. The Tsar used them. He did not own them. Nicholas's annual income as Tsar was 24 million gold rubles, drawn from his treasury allowance and profits from crown farmland. From this he funded palace staffs, imperial theatres, family annuities, pensions, and charitable obligations. Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, who knew the imperial finances intimately, recalled that before the end of the year the Tsar was usually penniless, and sometimes he reached this embarrassing state by autumn. In 1896, the year of his coronation, Nicholas's personal funds totaled just 2 million rubles and 355,000 francs. By 1917, his liquid personal wealth had shrunk to roughly 1 million rubles. Count Paul Benkendorf, the Grand Marshal, estimated the total family financial resources at 12.5 to 17.5 million rubles, a figure that Prince Felix Yusupov's family, with its 57 palaces and vast estates, could have exceeded with real estate alone. But the crown property was staggering. The constellation of imperial palaces included the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, 1,500 rooms, 117 staircases, over 233,000 square metres of floor space. The Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, where Nicholas and Alexandra actually lived, a neoclassical residence surrounded by a park of 300 hectares. The Catherine Palace next door, home to the legendary Amber Room. 6 tons of Baltic amber, gold leaf and mirrors, valued even then at the equivalent of 11 times the price of the same weight in gold. Peterhof on the Gulf of Finland, the Russian Versailles, with its grand cascade of 64 fountains and over 200 bronze statues. Gatchina, south of Petrograd, personally favoured by Alexander III and home to one of the finest palace armories in Europe. And Livadia in Crimea, rebuilt in 1911 in white Inkerman limestone in the Italian Renaissance style, where the family spent their happiest summers. The Hermitage collection had been built across a century and a half. Catherine the Great began it in 1764 with 225 paintings purchased from Berlin merchant Johann Ernst Gotskowski. She added entire collections wholesale, the Crozat collection from Paris, the Walpole collection from Houghton Hall in England, the Baudouin collection from France. By 1917, the Hermitage held tens of thousands of artworks, including masterworks by Rembrandt, Raphael, Titian, Rubens, Velázquez, and Van Eyck. It was, by any measure, one of the 3 or 4 greatest art collections on earth. And then there were the eggs. Between 1885 and 1916, the House of Fabergé created 50 imperial Easter eggs, 10 commissioned by Alexander III and 40 by Nicholas II, who gave 2 per year, one to his mother Maria Feodorovna and one to his wife Alexandra. The first, the hen egg of 1885, cost 4,151 rubles. Each subsequent egg grew more elaborate. The coronation egg of 1897 contained a miniature gold replica of the coronation coach that took craftsmen 15 months to build. The Trans-Siberian Railway egg of 1900 held a clockwork gold and platinum train with ruby headlights. The winter egg of 1913 was studded with approximately 3,000 diamonds and engraved ice crystals enclosing a flower basket symbolizing spring. The crown jewels themselves sat in the diamond room of the Winter Palace, maintained by the cabinet of His Imperial Majesty. The centerpiece was the Great Imperial Crown, created for Catherine the Great's coronation in 1762 by the Swiss jeweller Jérémie Posier and completed in just 2.5 months. It held 4,936 diamonds, totaling approximately 2,858 carats, and 75 large Indian pearls, topped by a 398.72 carat red spinel, the second largest spinel in the world. The imperial scepter held the Orloff diamond, 189.62 carats with a faint bluish-green tinge. The Shah diamond, 88.7 carats, carried 3 Persian inscriptions spanning 233 years of history. The myth of vast Romanov deposits in the Bank of England has been largely debunked. Alexander III had deposited approximately 90 million gold rubles there, inherited from Alexander II. But Nicholas actively withdrew these funds and transferred them into Russian investments. He closed his English accounts during the war. 7 million rubles sent to a Berlin bank for his children were destroyed by Weimar hyperinflation. The legendary London fortune was, by 1917, gone. This was the empire of objects. This was what the decrees dissolved. The palaces fell first. The Winter Palace had already been partly a military hospital since 1915, with the provisional government occupying its northwest corner from February to October 1917. On the night of October the 25th, Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Antonov of Zayenko stormed it in the relatively bloodless action that toppled Kerensky's government. Antonov of Zayenko ordered the legendary wine cellar sealed to prevent soldiers' drunkenness. The seal was broken. Red wine ran through the gutters of Palace Embankment. By October the 30th, the Winter Palace was declared part of the Hermitage museums. The Alexander Palace, the family home, the private residence, the place where Alexei had played in the garden and the girls had embroidered on the mauve boudoir settees, opened as a museum on June the 23rd, 1918. Its interiors were preserved as though the family had just stepped out for a walk in the park and never returned. The Catherine Palace opened June the 9th. Peterhof was nationalised the same year. Gatchina, which had briefly served as Kerensky's headquarters during his failed counter-attack in November 1917, opened as a museum on May the 19th, 1918. Livadia, the family's Crimean sanctuary, suffered the most degrading transformation. Plundered first by local revolutionaries and then by German forces, it formally opened as a public museum on July the 25th, 1922. 3 years later, it was converted to a tuberculosis sanatorium. The palace carpets were given to the Emir of Bukhara's residence. Nicholas's children's dolls were distributed to orphans. The Empress's curtains were sewn into clothing for the poor. What remained inside these palaces now required counting. The Gokran, the state repository of valuables, was established by decree on February the 3rd, 1920, with the mandate to centralise, store and account for all values confiscated by the Russian state. Its mandate covered gold, platinum, silver bullion, diamonds, coloured precious stones, and pearls. All Soviet organisations were required to deliver their valuables within 3 months. The location chosen carried its own irony. The Gokran was housed in the lone treasury building on Nastasinsky Lane in central Moscow, a structure whose construction had begun in 1913 to celebrate the tercentenary of the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas II had personally selected the architects. The imperial regalia and crown jewels had been evacuated from Petrograd to the Kremlin armory in 1914 as a wartime precaution. They arrived without inventories. When officials finally opened the sealed trunks in 1922, they found what one account described as a jaw-dropping panorama. 773 items, including coronation crowns, hundreds of necklaces, bracelets, and tiaras that represented 3 centuries of accumulation by successive empresses. The mineralogist Alexander Fersman was assigned to catalogue and appraise everything. His 4-volume work, Russia's Treasure of Diamonds and Precious Stones, published in 1925 and 1926, appeared in Russian, English, French, and German. The multilingual publication was not an act of scholarship. It was a sales catalogue. To evaluate the jewellery, Soviet authorities recruited former Fabergé craftsmen, including Agathon Fabergé, son of the founder. Agathon was 44 years old. He had lost his business, his home, and most of his family's possessions. He had been imprisoned in a concentration camp. He had been taken out to be shot 3 times. Each time he was returned to his cell. Now he was brought from prison to sort and appraise the very treasures his father's workshop had created. He performed the work. He was returned to confinement. The items were divided into 3 categories. Category 1, the Inviolable Fund, comprised 366 items valued at 654,935,000 rubles. The coronation regalia alone was valued at 375 million rubles. Category 2 held items of historical interest. Category 3 was marked for immediate sale. In practice, the boundary between the categories proved meaningless. Of all the imperial treasures the Soviets catalogued for sale, the crown jewels, the Hermitage paintings, the Fabergé eggs, which loss do you think was most irreversible? Tell me in the comments. The crown jewels were the first to leave. On March the 16th, 1927, Christie's in London offered 124 lots under the title Magnificent Jewellery, which form part of the Russian state jewels. The lots had been purchased in bulk from Gokran by British dealer Norman Weiss. The transaction that made the auction possible was staggering in its asymmetry. Weiss had acquired 9.644 kilograms of imperial jewellery for £50,000, weight of gold prices for objects of incalculable historical significance. The items scattered across the globe through chains of resale that would take decades to trace. The imperial nuptial crown, more than 1,500 diamonds, passed through Sotheby's in 1966 to serial. Heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post. It sits today in the Hillwood Estate Museum in Washington. An 1841 Carl Bollin tiara, 928 diamonds and 25 drop pearls, sold at the same auction for £6,000. It passed through the Duke of Marlborough's hands. It ended up with Imelda Marcos. It was confiscated by the Philippine Central Bank in 1986. Catherine the Great's 389 pearl necklace was bought by Cartier and resold to the wife of automobile magnate Horace Dodge for $820,000. Maria Feodorovna's 200-carat sapphire went to Cartier, New York in 1928. Tiaras were dismantled. Their stones were sold separately. The metalwork was melted. Between 1927 and approximately 1936, 569 of the 773 items were sold abroad. Over 92% of the 2% of Unillustrated items in Fersman's catalogue, the ones without published photographs to create public attachment, left Russia. Dmitry Ivanov, head of the Kremlin Armory Chamber, who had helped catalogue the jewels and fought desperately to prevent the sales, learned in early 1930 that further seizures were planned. He committed suicide. The next day, 100 objects of French silver were withdrawn by Gokran. In June of that year, more than 300 antiques and 11 Fabergé Easter eggs were seized from the armory in a single action. The paintings followed the jewels. The engine was Stalin's first 5-year plan, launched in 1928. The plan demanded massive foreign currency to purchase American tractors, German machinery, and industrial equipment for the forced industrialization of a peasant economy. Art and jewels were simply another export commodity, ranked alongside grain, timber, and furs. The Antiquariat, the head office for buying and realizing antiquarian objects, was created in 1925, reorganized in 1928, transferred to the People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade in 1929, and wound up in 1937. Its members were Communist Party functionaries, not curators. The Hermitage was ordered to prepare lists of paintings for export with a minimum target of 250 works at 5,000 rubles each. Museum staff fought back with desperate ingenuity. They overvalued items to reduce the number withdrawn. They hid lesser-known works behind more famous ones in storage. They denied the importance of masterpieces to the officials who came with requisition orders. Paintings were removed at night in prison vans. Warning signs read, "Painting taken for photographing." Staff who protested too loudly were arrested. Between 1928 and 1934, approximately 2,880 paintings were sent abroad from the Hermitage. Of these, 250 were considered major works. 48 acknowledged masterpieces left Russia permanently, including works by Raphael, Van Eyck, Botticelli, Titian, Velázquez, and Rembrandt. Most sold at half or a quarter of market value. The largest single buyer was Andrew Mellon, the United States Secretary of the Treasury. Mellon learned of the secret Hermitage sales through Knoedler and Company, his regular New York art dealer. The paintings travelled through an elaborate chain from Leningrad to Moscow, then to the Matthiessen Gallery in Berlin, then to Kolnagi's in London, and finally to Knoedler in New York. Mellon had the right of first refusal on everything the consortium purchased. Between June 1930 and April 1931, Mellon acquired 21 masterpieces for $654,052.94. The crown of the purchase was Raphael's Alba. Madonna, bought in April 1931 for $1,166,400, the largest sum ever paid for a single painting at that time. He also acquired Jan van Eyck's Annunciation for $502,899, Titian's Venus with a mirror, Botticelli's Adoration of the Magi, Raphael's St. George and the Dragon, 5 works by Rembrandt and his workshop, 4 by Van Dyck, 2 by Frans Hals. The purchases remained secret until November 4th, 1933, when the New York Times reported Hermitage sales. Mellon denied owning the paintings, which he kept in his apartment at 1785 Massachusetts Avenue and its basement. The full extent emerged during his 1935 tax fraud trial. He had claimed the paintings as a charitable deduction. In 1937, Mellon donated all 21 paintings and the funds to build a museum to the United States government. He died that same year. The National Gallery of Art opened on March 17, 1941, with the Hermitage works as its founding nucleus. A 1950 Soviet publication accidentally printed a photograph of the Alba Madonna without realizing it had been hanging in Washington for 20 years. Kalusta Gulbenkian, the Armenian oil magnate known as Mr. 5%, was the first foreign buyer to purchase Hermitage paintings. Negotiating through Soviet trade representative Georgy Pyatakov in Paris, he made 4 documented purchases between April 1929 and October 1930, totaling approximately £379,000. He acquired Rembrandt's portrait of Titus, Rembrandt's Pallas Athena, Rubens's portrait of Helena Formant, Houdon's celebrated sculpture Diana the Huntress. 51 objects in all. These now form a cornerstone of the Calousta Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon. Gulbenkian, to his credit, warned the Soviets on July 18, 1930, that selling museum artifacts would harm their government's credit. They sold them anyway. The sales peaked in 1931 at 9.5 million rubles. They largely ceased by 1934, partly due to an extraordinary intervention. Joseph Orbeli, the Hermitage's deputy director, wrote directly to Stalin protesting the sale of Persian artifacts. Stalin responded on October 25, 1932, instructing the Foreign Trade Department not to sell ancient Oriental items. Orbeli then cleverly recatalogued some European pieces as Oriental to bring them under the protection of the directive. He replaced the compliant director Boris Legrand in 1934 and effectively stopped the hemorrhage. By then, the damage was irreversible. The Fabergé eggs took the strangest journeys of all. Armand Hammer arrived in Soviet Russia on July 5, 1921. He was 23 years old, the son of Julius Hammer, a co-founder of the Communist Labour Party of America. He had come ostensibly to collect pharmaceutical debts. He met Lenin personally on October 22, 1921, receiving an autographed photograph and instructions that Soviet officials should in every way help him. Hammer received the first American business concession, an asbestos mine, and soon represented 38 American companies, including Ford Motor Company. With his brother Victor, a Princeton art history graduate, Hammer used his profits to acquire Romanov treasures at favourable prices, earning a 10% commission from the Soviet government on art resold abroad. He acquired at least 10 imperial Fabergé eggs, more than any other individual buyer. Beginning in 1932, he pioneered the practice of selling genuine imperial art through American department stores. Lord and Taylor, Gimbel's, Saks, Fifth Avenue. During the Depression, Fabergé eggs sold at auction for as little as $400 to $500. 5 eggs went to Lillian Thomas Pratt, who paid on her Lord and Taylor charge card. Those 5 eggs are now among the greatest treasures of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. Hammer's reputation never recovered from scrutiny. Historian Natalia Semyonova called him a diabolical figure. According to Fabergé scholar Geza von Habsburg, Commissar Anastas Mikoyan provided Hammer with original Fabergé hallmarking tools to finish or authenticate questionable pieces, generating the phenomenon collectors came to call Fabergé. Much of what Hammer sold as Romanov treasure, china from pre-war hotels, linens from monasteries, had no relation to the imperial family at all. Emanuel Snowman of Wartsky, jewellers in London, took a different path. Travelling to Moscow repeatedly from 1925 onward, he purchased approximately 9 imperial Fabergé eggs and hundreds of other Romanov objects from the antiquariate. He bought the winter egg for £450. He sold it in 1934 to Lord Allington for £1,500. His son Kenneth grew up playing with real Fabergé eggs in the family shop on Grafton Street. Ian Fleming immortalised Wartsky in the James Bond novella The Property of a Lady. One egg's journey encapsulates the entire story. The third imperial egg, gold, diamond, sapphire set with a Vacheron Constantine lady's watch inside was created in 1887 for Alexander III to give to Maria Feodorovna. After the revolution, it was catalogued by Gokran and sold. It disappeared. In the early 2000s, a scrap metal dealer in the American Midwest purchased a gold object at a flea market for $13,302, intending to melt it for its gold content. He failed to find a buyer at a profit. The egg sat on his kitchen shelf for 8 years. In 2012, he Googled the name inscribed on the watch mechanism and found an article by Fabergé expert Kieran McCarthy of Wartsky describing the missing third imperial egg. McCarthy authenticated it in 2014. The egg sold privately for an estimated $33 million. The scrap dealer had been eating breakfast in front of it for nearly a decade. If you're enjoying this, subscribing is the best way to support the channel. It's free and it helps us keep going. Not everything fell into Bolshevik hands. The most dramatic rescue was carried out by Albert Henry Stopford, a British antiques dealer and diplomatic courier. In August and September of 1917, after the February Revolution, but before the October coup, Stopford entered the Vladimir Palace in St. Petersburg disguised as a workman. He broke into an undiscovered safe belonging to Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, known in court circles as Miechen. He wrapped over 200 jewels in old newspaper, stuffed them into 2 Gladstone bags and escaped the country via Sweden. He arrived in London around October the 6th, 1917, carrying 244 items. The Vladimir Palace was ransacked by Bolsheviks shortly after. Among the rescued treasures was the Vladimir Tiara, created by Bolin in 1874, an iconic design of interlocking diamond-set circles with hanging pearl drops. Miechen's children sold it after her death in 1920. Queen Mary purchased it in 1921 and commissioned Garrard to adapt it with 15 Cambridge emeralds as an alternative to the pearls. It became one of Queen Elizabeth II's most frequently worn tiaras. It remains in the British Royal Collection. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna escaped Crimea aboard HMS Marlborough on April the 11th, 1919. She was accompanied by roughly 80 people, including Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich and Prince Felix Yusupov. As the ship passed the harbour at Yalta, white Russian soldiers on shore recognized the Empress standing on deck. They sang the imperial anthem. It was the last time the anthem was sung to a living member of the dynasty on Russian soil. Maria Feodorovna had hidden jewels in cocoa tins. She kept her everyday jewels in a chest under her bed at Vedura in Denmark, stubbornly refusing to sell despite financial pressure from her daughters and the Danish royal family. After her death on October the 13th, 1928, the jewel box was sealed and dispatched to London by diplomatic courier. Opened at Windsor Castle in May 1929, it contained 76 items. The diamond star of the Order of St. Andrew, ropes of pearls, the largest the size of a cherry, brooches blazing with diamonds, emeralds, rubies and sapphires. A jeweller estimated the contents at a minimum of £350,000 to £700,000 approximately. £12 million in today's money. Queen Mary purchased several pieces at prices critics considered below market. A sapphire bandeau for £6,000. A diamond bar brooch for £555. Multiple pieces from this collection continue to be worn by members of the British royal family. A Russian sapphire cluster brooch appeared on Queen Camilla at a Commonwealth Day reception in 2025. The Yusupov family, arguably wealthier than the Romanovs themselves, managed to save remarkable items. Felix Yusupov retrieved 2 Rembrandt paintings from the Moika Palace by removing them from their frames and folding them into luggage. He carried the Sultan of Morocco diamond, the Polar Star diamond, 41.28 carats, a Type 2A stone from the Golconda mines, which sold at Christie's Geneva in 1980 for $4.6 million, then a world record per carat, and Marie Antoinette's diamond earrings. But in 1925, Bolsheviks discovered a hidden cache in the Yusupov's Moscow house. 7 chests containing over a ton of silver, 13 kilograms of gold, 255 brooches, 42 bracelets, and 12 tiaras. What escaped and what did not were separated by nothing more than which house the family had remembered to empty. The most haunting discovery came at Yekaterinburg. When the Romanov family was executed on July the 17th, 1918, the Tsarina and her daughters had sewn a fortune in diamonds and pearls into their corsets and undergarments, a practice they had codenamed for arranging the medicines. The jewels deflected bullets during the initial fusillade, acting as crude body armour and prolonging the daughters' suffering. Approximately 70 bullets were fired in the chaotic execution, which lasted roughly 20 minutes. Yurovsky's men stripped the bodies in the forest afterward and recovered the gemstones. The diamonds that the family had hidden against the possibility of escape had made their deaths harder and longer. What survives in Russia today sits behind bulletproof glass in the Kremlin. The Diamond Fund opened to the public in 1967 and is now protected by Federal Law No. 41 of March 26, 1998, which declares the collection an indivisible collection of unique jewellery in federal ownership, not subject to alienation. The Great Imperial Crown sits in its case, 4,936 diamonds, 75 pearls, the Great Spinel at its apex. The Orloff diamond remains in the imperial scepter. The Shah diamond, with its 3 Persian inscriptions spanning the years 1591 to 1824, is displayed nearby. These survived because they fell into Category 1 of the 1922 valuations. They are the 26.4% that did not leave. The palaces have been restored, though their journeys were punishing. Nearly all suffered catastrophic damage during the Nazi occupation of 1941 to 1944. Catherine Palace's Amber Room was dismantled and stolen by German soldiers. It has never been found. A painstaking reconstruction completed in 2003 now stands in its place. The Alexander Palace reopened its East Wing on August 1, 2021, the 104th anniversary of the family's departure, with 13 reconstructed interiors including Nicholas's study, the Moorish bathroom, and the mauve boudoir. Only 7,754 of the original 30,382 objects survive. The major palace complexes around St. Petersburg were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1990. In February 2004, Russian oligarch Viktor Vekselberg preempted a planned Sotheby's auction by purchasing the entire Malcolm Forbes collection of Fabergé for just over $100 million in a private transaction. The collection included 9 imperial Easter eggs and approximately 180 other Fabergé objects. Vekselberg opened the Fabergé Museum in the restored Narishkin-Shuvalov Palace on the Fontanka River in St. Petersburg on November 19, 2013. It houses over 4,000 works, including more than 1,000 Fabergé objects, the largest collection in the world. Today's Romanov claimants have achieved no property restitution. Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, born 1953 in Madrid, styles herself head of the Russian imperial house, but has never been recognized by the Russian government. The rival Romanov Family Association explicitly states that Russia's form of government should be determined democratically. In 2009, Russia granted posthumous rehabilitation to Nicholas II and his family. The Gesture carried no property implications. The state treats all former imperial holdings as inalienable public property. The imperial crown still sits in the Kremlin, 4,936 diamonds catching the light behind bulletproof glass. The Alba Madonna hangs in Washington. The Vladimir tiara sits in a vault at Buckingham Palace. The winter egg, sold for £450 in the early 1930s, brought $30.2 million at Christie's in 2025. And somewhere between a Midwest kitchen and a London auction house, a jewelled gold egg that once belonged to an empress spent 8 years as a shelf ornament above a man's breakfast table. The Romanov fortune was not destroyed. It was atomized, scattered across 5 continents, into museums and vaults and palaces and flea markets, into the collections of oil magnates and serial heiresses, and a Philippine dictator's wife. The dynasty that built it is gone. The objects outlasted every one of them.